Greetings from Geneva and welcome to Webinar 4, Using Molecular Markers in DOS Examination and the Role of the BMT. My name is Leontino Taveira and I work for the UPOV office. This is the fourth webinar of a series that has been taking place over the course of this week. It was back in 2002 when the technical committee agreed that preparatory workshops should be held prior to the technical working party sessions with the aim to help some delegates to participate more effectively in the meetings. Last year, the technical committee agreed to organize those preparatory workshops as a series of webinars, which have been taking place over the course of this week. We've started on Monday and we have now reached the fourth webinar, which will deal specifically with using molecular markers in DOS examination and the role of the BMT. This webinar is going to be divided in 4 parts, and the first 2 parts are presentations on current guidance within UPOV on using molecular markers for DOS examination, and followed by the role of the BMT, which is our group specifically commissioned to discussing the use of molecular techniques in DOS examination and providing guidance. Then it's going to be followed by a panel discussion with our experts from UPOV members, and we're going to complete the webinar with a session on questions and answers. Parts A, B, and C of this webinar are going to be recorded and are going to go on the UPOV website, more specifically on the Technical Working Party's website. So the video recordings will be there available, and we will encourage experts to watch these videos. The final part of this webinar, the session on questions and answers, will only be recorded for internal purposes for the UPOV office. It will not be made available on the UPOV website. The first part of this webinar will explain briefly UPOV guidance on the use of molecular markers in DOS examination. Before doing so, I'd like to recall the importance of a harmonized approach within UPOV. The mutual recognition of DOS test results, cooperation in DOS testing, exchanging test results depend on this harmonized approach within all UPOV members. This is also the basis for internationally recognized variety descriptions and effective protection. In this sense, it is very important that all UPOV members recognize and accept the use of molecular markers for examining particular crops or examining particular characteristics. UPOV guidance on the use of molecular marker techniques is divided in 3 documents. 2 of these documents are information documents. One of these documents is actual guidance on how to use molecular markers in DOS examination. The first document, Information Document 17, provides basic guidelines for constituting databases. The second information document is Information Document number 18, which is an exploratory document on possible uses for molecular markers in the examination of DOS. That document was adopted in 2011. It will be explained in a minute. At the end of this presentation, we will mention the actual guidance on how molecular markers are currently recommended or proposed to be used for DOS examination purposes. The first document, Information Document number 17, Guidelines for DNA Profiling and Molecular Marker Selection, Database Construction, our BMT guidelines. The objective of this document is to provide basic information for UPOV members in constructing databases, even when these databases are built with different laboratories cooperating, using different technologies. And the objective is that this information could be reused, reproduced, even in different situations where laboratories have different equipments or use different chemicals. The final objective is to have quality information in databases, information which could be then shared and exchanged between UPOV members. The second document, information document number 18, is an exploratory document with the aim of reporting the outcomes of a 10 years process of consultation amongst UPOV members on possible uses of molecular markers for DUS examination. In the past decade, UPOV members were considering molecular markers for different applications related to DUS examination. Those were reported and consolidated in document INF 18. After that, a legal analysis was conducted to assess whether those uses of molecular markers were in fact compatible with the UPOV Convention. 4 basic models grouped the uses reported by UPOV members. 3 of these were considered as having a positive assessment relating to their compatibility with the UPOV Convention, whereas the use of molecular markers as characteristics by themselves was considered not to be in line with the UPOV Convention. That is, if the simple presence of a marker not linked to the expression of a phenotypical characteristic, this marker could not be used as a DUS characteristic, or that would not be in line with the UPOV Convention, as the UPOV Convention requires that Article 12 of the 1991 Act of the UPOV Convention requires that the examination includes the growing, the causing of growing the variety or taking over test reports. So someone has to grow the variety. And this last model, use of molecular marker characteristics, was considered not to be in line with the UPOV Convention. But now let's have a look at the models that did receive positive assessment. The first, calibrated molecular distance in the management of variety collections. In an ideal scenario, you could possibly find a linear correlation between the genetic distance and the phenotypical distance or difference between pairs of varieties. So in theory, this model although this model did receive a positive assessment relating to its compatibility with the UPOV Convention, currently there are no examples that demonstrate that a linear correlation between genetic and phenotypic distance could be found. The problem with this not linear correction is that once the arbitrary values, threshold values, are set and displayed, if you look at the chart in the type 4 situation, where you have a distinctness assessed via molecular markers, but this distinctness cannot be observed in a field trial, thus creating a situation where different UPOV members could reach different conclusions when using different methodologies, which is considered detrimental to harmonization. This situation is particularly of concern in relation to the situation displayed on screen. For the remaining models with positive assessment and for which real examples were provided, document TGP 15 displays and explains these models. So coming from document INF 18, from all those possibilities, those models with positive assessment and with examples are compiled in document TGP 15. There are different models in document TGP15. There are two different models, although the models are not numbered. The numbering may cause some confusion here, but the model, the first model, is characteristic-specific molecular markers. There are two examples. The first example is the presence of a herbicide tolerance marker. So example one, gene-specific marker for herbicide tolerance introduced by genetic modification. The assumptions to be met here are that there's a you can reliably verify that when the marker is present, there is the expression of the characteristic. So whenever you find the herbicide tolerance marker, you can be sure that the characteristic will be expressed. Also, different markers for this, observing this same characteristics would simply be different methods for assessing the same characteristic. It's easy to imagine that you may have different methods to observe the same characteristic. The characteristic being the plant being tolerant for having been sprayed with herbicide. So you can grow the plants and spray them with herbicide and observe the characteristic on the field, or you can replace that with a safer, quicker, and possibly cheaper examination in the laboratory using a different method to observe the same characteristic. The second model, the second example to this same model of characteristic-specific molecular markers is the characteristic-specific molecular marker with incomplete information on state of expression. Here is a reproduction of the text in documents TGP15 with the example that is provided for such marker with incomplete information on state of expression. It is well known that when marker T2 or TM2 or TM22, when this marker is found, there is the expression of resistance in tomato plants against the mosaic virus. So if you have a DUS, if you have a DNA assay, a bioassay, and find the marker, you can see here the blue rectangles. If you find the marker and there is the presence of the resistant allele, there will be resistance present for mosaic virus. So information goes one way as to when the marker is found, when the marker is present, resistance is also present. Whereas in different situations where the marker is not found, the allele found is the susceptible allele, there could be resistance based on another gene, on another mechanism, as well as there could be resistance absent. So the plant, the variety could be susceptible to mosaic virus. In summary, when the resistant allele is found present, you know the variety is resistant, but when the susceptible allele is found, you do not know, you cannot tell whether the variety is or is not resistant, because resistance may be due to a different gene. The following model from document TGP15 is combining phenotypic and molecular distances in the management of variety collections. This model aims at reducing the size of trials by adding another layer of another threshold to enable reducing the size of the trial by excluding further varieties that could be considered as sufficiently distinct and therefore not requiring to be compared side by side or in the growing trial. This model, first developed and demonstrated by the colleagues from France, is based on the combination of phenotypic differences and molecular distances to reduce the size of the trial and therefore excluding varieties from comparison against candidate varieties on the basis that they first assess that there's reliable information that the molecular distances are sufficiently related to the phenotypic distances, that the method selects varieties in the collection which are similar to the candidate, and does not create a situation where varieties that should have been compared end up being excluded from comparison. And in this schematic, you can see that the Gaia morphological distance is used as a measurement of phenotypical distances. What initially would have required a minimum distance of 6 points in Gaia distance for morphological distance could be reduced by the inclusion of a threshold for molecular distances, which was established on the basis of field experimentation conducted by the experts, the crop experts. The model combining phenotypic and molecular distances in the management of variety collections also has a second example, which is genetic selection of similar varieties for the first growing cycle. So it is a genetic selection first being conducted to provide greater information. This model was developed by the colleagues in the Netherlands who demonstrated its applicability with a real example for French beans. The initial step is to obtain DNA information from the candidate variety, and therefore comparing the profile against other varieties in the database, the DNA database, to identify first those varieties that are genetically similar. In addition to this genetic information on similarity, qualitative characteristics, those that do not change with environment and are very much reliable, were also used as an additional layer to support further excluding varieties from the growing trial. It is important to recall that this is a method for selecting varieties that will be grown side by side, or at least in the same place, in the same testing station. Therefore, enabling the authority to obtain data which is comparable due to the varieties having been grown all in the same location, in the same trial. With morphological information collected from the same growing trial, the experts can then perform another check for similar varieties which may have been required or which should be grown side by side, and take a decision on whether another growing cycle should be organized, including any further varieties that should have been compared based on those results coming from the same testing station, or if clearly distinct, the variety could be then exempt from a second growing cycle. To summarize this presentation and bring it to a close, I would like to use the frequently asked questions which are available on the UPOV website to summarize the situation in UPOV in relation to the use of molecular markers for DOS examination. We are often questioned whether it is possible to obtain protection of a variety on the basis of its DNA profile. The clear answer is that for a variety to be protected, it needs to be clearly distinguishable on the basis of characteristics that are physically, morphologically expressed: plant height, time of flowering, fruit color, disease resistances, or others. Nonetheless, DNA profile is useful for supporting information, although it is not the basis for granting protection for a variety. Of course, this is a rather superficial answer, and we also have another answer, providing a bit more detail to explain the situation. And the question is whether UPOV allows molecular marker techniques in DUS examination. So it is here, the explanation is that it is important to recall that in some cases, while varieties may have different DNA profiles, they may be phenotypically identical. And you can also imagine the other way around, where varieties are visually very different, but you may not be able to find the site of mutation, the difference, using a given set of molecular markers. So this may be the case for certain mutants. Also, in relation to the use of molecular markers that are not linked necessarily to the expression of a phenotypical characteristic, it could be possible to use a large, eventually limitless number of markers to find differences between varieties at the genetic level, which may not be seen and observed at the phenotypic level. So on this basis, UPOV agreed two models for which molecular markers could be used in DUS examination. The two models previously explained. The first, when you know there's a reliable link between the presence of a marker and expression of a phenotypical characteristic. And the second model, combining differences in molecular and phenotypical differences, so combining phenotypic and molecular distances to reduce the size of the growing trial. Now, on this note, I would like to pause and give the floor to my colleague, Mr. Manabu Suzuki. Manabu, you have the floor, please.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Manabu Suzuki, working for the Upof. So I would like to present the role of the BMT. So the BMT is a group to open DUS experts, biochemical and molecular specialists, and the plant breeders. The role of the BMT is, as you can see, the review of general development in biochemical and molecular techniques, establish guidance for biochemical and molecular methodologies and their harmonization, and to develop guidelines regarding the management and harmonization of the database of the biochemical molecular information in conjunction with the TWC, and also to provide a forum for a discussion on the use of biochemical and molecular techniques in, for example, variety identification. So we will have the BMT meeting this year on September 22nd to 24th, hosted by the United States of America, and to be held via electronic means. The invitation will be circulated soon. We also invite participants to submit papers for posting on the item discussed at the BMT this year. For example, that on the presentation on new developments in BMT, report of work in relation to DS examination, variety description, database, method for analysis, and the management of molecular data and variety identification. Also, we will discuss the confidentiality, ownerships, and access to molecular data, including model agreement template. So we look forward to receiving papers from participants once the circular is issued. BMT has been highlighting the interest in the cooperation between the authorities, private sectors, and researchers on what area and how they would like to cooperate with the work on biochemical and molecular techniques. Although it is not easy to interact in this situation, we plan to have discussion groups to be formed by club type for participants to exchange information on their work and explore the areas for cooperation. The result of the discussion last year is available at our website. In relation to the cooperation between the international organizations, we have conducted a survey to methods as the basis to develop inventory on the use of molecular marker techniques by club in coordination with OECD and the BMT. There will be a report on joint documents explaining the principal features of system of OECD, ISTA, and the Upof. In addition, there are a list of possible joint initiatives with OECD and ISTA, such as joint workshop to discuss the definitions of terminology using molecular techniques for the future harmonization. As you recall, that the UPOV Council made a decision to merge the BMT and TWC and create the Technical Working Party on Testing Methods and Techniques, TWM, which will take effect on 2022. The TWM will be open to the relevant experts, same as BMT. Last year, the UPOV Council approved the establishment and terms of reference for the TWM. This TOR encompasses the work of the BMT and the TWC, so there is no missing elements covering the range of the works elements covered in both the BMT and TWC. So I'd like to finalize this presentation, and I would like to pass the floor to Leontino. Thank you.
Thank you, Manabu. So now we continue on to the following part. The third part of this webinar is a panel discussion. I would like to invite our dear panelists, Ms. Amanda van Dijk from the Netherlands, Mr. Jin Ki-young from the Republic of Korea, and Mr. Mariano Mangieri from Argentina, to please switch on your cameras. We are going to have a panel discussion where the panelists are going to comment on the presentations just now given and illustrate a bit of the theory previously presented with some real situations, their experience according to the use of molecular markers in their countries. We are going to give the floor individually to each panelist, and we would like to start first with Ms. Amanda van Dijk. Please, Amanda, you have the floor.
Good afternoon to you all. I'm Amanda van Dijk. I work at Tuinbouw in the Netherlands. And today you see me at home with these nice flowers in the background. I used to work for many years as a DUS expert in vegetables. And today I'm managing the Tuinbouw team of DUS experts. In vegetables, the use of DNA techniques is in a starting up phase. And since the beginning, I'm working at Tuinbouw with how to use DNA techniques in the DUS test. I'm now participating in the BMT meeting since 5 years. So just that you know me a bit better. I continue with the presentation that was given by Leontino on the BMT techniques and all the documents that are available on the Upof website on this. And I tell you more on how we deal with it at Tuinbouw. We apply molecular techniques today in our main crops: potato, phalaenopsis, tomato, lettuce, cabbage. And we have 2 important reasons to do so: a better decision on distinctness. You understand that in case of a vegetative propagated material, it's easier to keep a complete DNA database than a variety collection of living plants. So we think that you can have a better decision on distinctness. And the second important reason is efficiency, more efficiency by having a smaller field and less time to do your observations. I'll explain a little bit this efficiency part. And I go to the model of management of the variety collection by the example of genetic selection of similar varieties for the first growing cycle. It's a long title. We think this example is safe to use in crops with 2 growing cycles. Like in vegetables, we normally have 2 growing cycles. And in vegetables, we have rather small number of applications. And I think that's the reason that we do not know any thresholds. We saw these nice pictures of thresholds, but we don't know in vegetable which percentage of similarity leads to distinctness. So up to now, we cannot use such a threshold value. And that's why we developed that example of genetic selection of similar varieties for the first growing cycle. Normally, we have to put all the similar varieties in the growing trial. And the process to determine which variety from the variety collection has to be put in the growing trial is very delicate. If you select more similar varieties, you have costs for growing them and time to do all the visual comparisons. Because you have to compare this new application with maybe 15 or 20 existing varieties, existing similar varieties. And that takes a lot of time. If you select fewer similar varieties, you have the risk to come to a wrong decision on distinctness. That's clear. So it is a very delicate process. We perform it with a highly qualified and experienced staff, and it may take up to 3 hours for one application. It depends on the crop and the information in the technical questionnaire. And we take into account that the information that is written in the technical questionnaire comes from the breeder, and who did his best to give all the correct information in the technical questionnaire, but it comes from the trials from that breeder in his or her environment, and it can be different from our environment. So we must be very careful, and that's why it takes so many hours. So when we can use this example of a genetic selection of similar varieties for the growing trial, we need to have DNA profiles of all the varieties of our whole collection. And if we have such a database with DNA profiles, we can check which varieties are genetically similar to my new application. I can ask it to my laboratory, and I have the results within a few weeks. Then I get from them a result of genetically close varieties, and it will be, for example, about 5 similar varieties. So I only have to grow 5 similar varieties, and I only have to do 5 visual comparisons in the field. At the end of year 1, you have these 5 comparisons, and I have a complete description of the applications. So not only the information from the technical questionnaire, but a complete description, all characteristics in our circumstances. And at that moment, you can put this whole description in the database of morphological descriptions, and you can check, is there any possible similar variety in the variety collection which is maybe morphologically very close, but genetically different. We must be very careful about that. But this process to check a complete description in the database is much less delicate and takes much less time. I think you can do it in half an hour. So we start a normal second growing cycle with this extra similar variety coming from the paper selection. In total, after these 2 growing cycles, we have fewer similar varieties to grow, we have fewer visual comparisons to do, and less time to select similar varieties. That's the efficiency that we see. But we need something. We need a method to profile all the varieties. We choose to have an S&P method. We need profiles of all our varieties. And then you have to do a DNA test on the candidate. So the first 2 steps ask for very high costs. And I think that's very important that we cooperate together. But we must not forget to keep the data confidential. Companies are very much worried about the confidentiality of all these DNA data. So the efficiency is there when everything is up and running, but to get there is a long and costly process. If I can have 1 more minute. We have also quite some experience in vegetables in doing a DNA marker test instead of a bioassay to test for disease resistance. This is very efficient for us. And a combination of these two is possible. We see it in tomato. Tomato is vegetable, normally 2 growing cycles, and a lot of resistance characteristics are involved. So if we apply this model of genetic selection of similar varieties for the first growing trial, and we do a DNA test on the candidate, then at the same time you may get the result for the resistance characteristics. So it is very, in tomato, these resistances are very important to determine distinctness, and it saves a lot of costs if we combine the both methods. I think this is it from my side on the practical side on the application of the UPOV models. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Amanda. We would now like to invite Mr. Jin-Ki Jung from the Republic of Korea to take the floor. Please, Mr. Jung.
Hello, I'm Jin-Ki Jung, work for KS Swiss in South Korea. I'm a molecular biologist, so let me introduce the application of a molecular mark on DUS test in Korea. In Korea, molecular marks have using for DUS test to select similar varieties since 2010. The role of molecular mark in DUS testing in Korea, it was not effective to select similar varieties with a mark because the mark is not a character specific, especially on TG, cross shape, color, size, and so on. It's just for discrimination of a variety, not correlate with a character on TG. I know many research groups try to find a DNA loci associated with a character on TG, but it is very difficult to mining the character-specific DNA loci for design molecular mark. This work needs many times, budget, energy, and so on. Therefore, maybe it's hard to develop and apply the character-specific mark to the Upof TG. So I would like to describe that the first model of the uses with a molecular mark in DUS testing. When you apply a molecular mark to the DUS test, it should be focused on whether the variety is the same or not in a maintenance work of a protected variety, or use to decide whether the submitted variety for PVP have stability or not in DUS testing. In Korea, we have experience in this kind of application. If so, I think that is the application of a molecular mark in these cases need to adapt in UPOV report. For example, if the variety have a lower than 90% genetic similarity in molecular analysis, and it did not have stability characteristic as second DUS test compared with first test. We can cancel this protection of a variety according to the UPOV report if it is adapted. The maintenance of a protected variety also can adapt this rule. Of course, the stress level of genetic similarity is very important, and it is need discussion and a consensus among all partners in UPOV if it's possible. The application of a molecular mark in these cases can make us have a time saving in DUS testing and management of protected varieties. According to this result, I have another opinion for is it possible to obtain protection of a variety on this basis of its DNA profile and the DNA profile is not the basis for the obtained protection of variety. In these cases, the DNA profile can be used as critical, I think so. In the role of BMT, I think the establishment of appropriate guideline for US molecular mark in case of testing the maintenance of the variety characteristics and stability test in DUS with the harmonization of the DUS and molecular technology. At BMT meeting to be held in September, I would like to share this kind of actual cases of molecular mark applications related to the specific DUS testing. The sharing of specific cases with a partner of a BMT will be a great opportunity to broaden our work on the PVP. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Young. We would now like to invite Mr. Mariano Mangieri from Argentina to take the floor. Please, Mariano, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lentino. Hello to everyone. My name is Mariano Mangieri, and I work in the PVP office in the National Institute of Seeds in Argentina. Thanks to the UPOV office for this opportunity, and thanks very much for the clear presentation. From my point of view, the merger of the BMT and the TWC into the new TWM is a great news, given that in my participation in the meetings held in Hangzhou in October 2019, it was clear that they share a large part of the work agenda. In relation with the UPOV office presentation, I'm here to briefly tell you about the Argentina experience in the use of UPOV Model 2, combining phenotypic distance with molecular distance in the management of the variety collection. In Argentina, the distinguished process of varieties has become complex in some species, such as soybean. The number of soybean varieties registered in the national list is 1,115, and we receive between 150 and 200 new applications per year. But this last year, we beat our record with 2,070 new applications. This clearly translates into large trials and high costs for the applicants, since these new candidates had to be compared with a large number of varieties. In order to reduce the number of varieties that had to be compared in the field, we resort to the use of UPOV Model 2 in a public and private initiative. Regarding the method, we use 858 soybean varieties from different breeding programs. DNA was extracted and samples were sent to an external genotyping service provided for genotyping with the soy S&P 6K, a subset chip of subset Illumina Infinium best chip soy S&P 50K. We selected relevant characteristics for the soybean distinguishing process and grouped them in 3 levels of variability. Then we assign its weightings to each combination of their expression levels. They were used for comparison with molecular process data and for the determination of the minimum phenotypic threshold. On the other hand, we select a set of 4,004 SNPs markers distributed in the genome that represent the genetic background and produce efficient discrimination power. We determine the molecular distance ratios and the minimum phenotypic distance threshold based on 3 years field trials that was necessary for UPOV Model 2. In this trial, 58 variety pairs were evaluated. They were classified in 2 groups. those for which phenotypic differentiation was very difficult, therefore their field evaluation was necessary. We call this group number 1. And those for which phenotypic differentiation was very easy, therefore their field evaluation was not necessary, we call group 2. The lower and the upper limits of all groups were evaluated, and it was concluded that 98% of the variety pairs in group 2 had genotypic distance above 0.36. Therefore, that value was taken as a molecular distance threshold. During the revalidation, 116 variety pairs were evaluated, grouping them into the mentioned groups, and it was obtained that 97% of the variety pairs in group 2 had genotypic distance above 0.36. So we keep this value as the molecular distance threshold. In relation to the result, the variety pairs who were located above the minimum phenotypic threshold and below the phenotypic plus distinction threshold, but above the molecular distance thresholds, this group is type 1 of the Leontino presentation. Leontino, you can show the slide number 11 of your presentation. Okay. I refer Leontino to the other graph where you have a 4 type of groups. Okay, this here. Okay, the variety pairs in called type 1 represents the 50% of the universe of variety pairs below the plus distinction threshold. In other words, thanks to the use of Upof model 2, we obtain a reduction of 55% in the soybean variety pairs that should be evaluated in the field. For us, this is shocking. The mentioned results consider all events and maturity groups. But if we put the focus on events, for example, glyphosate resistance only and maturity groups 4 and 5, this percentage varies between 40 and 45%. Again, if we put the focus on the intact event and maturity group 7, we observe that this percentage is reduced to 35%. This is the second year that we use this model with the same result, and for us, it is a great tool since it greatly simplifies field work, allowing us to focus in the distinctness of very similar varieties. Currently, we are working with other crops such as wheat, cotton, and barley. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariano. I would like to thank the panelists that have joined us today, sharing your experiences and the use of molecular markers for DOS examination within your local contexts. I would like to thank the attendees who've joined us for the webinar today, for your questions and participation.